My name's Adam Oliver. I'm a professor of behavioural public policy in the social policy department here at the LSE. I'm going to chair this session today, as you know, I think. This session is, I think this is the 8th edition of the LSE, the Annual LSE Behavioural Public Policy Lecture. I think we've had one every year since 2017, apart from 1 year during the pandemic when we had to postpone. This year, I'm going to introduce Mario in a moment, but I just wanted to say that this lecture is kind of it's sponsored by the Department of Social Policy, by Mario himself, actually, because Mario kindly agreed to pay for his airfare to get here, and by the International Behavioural Public Policy Association. So these lectures really are part of what's called the International Behavioural Public Policy Association, the IBPPA. And the IBPPA now holds all sorts of events, actually. Its flagship event is the annual conference that's been organised this year by, I promise I won't speak too long about this, but it's been organised by Sanchayan Banerjee at King's College in September. That's the flagship event that occurs every year, and that sort of floats around the world. But the IBPPA also has a number of sort of standing workshops as well, smaller scale workshops. We have one that floats between LSE and Cambridge on a yearly basis. We have one that's annual in Singapore, and we have one that's annual, hopefully annual from now on, in Mexico City as well. So if you want to know about the IBPPA, then have a look at its website, ibppa.org. I thought I should mention that. Okay, on to Mario. So Mario Rizzo is Professor of Economics at NYU. I'll just read out his other positions at NYU at the moment. He's the director of the program on the foundations of the market economy at NYU, and also at NYU, he's the co-director of the Classical Liberalism Institute. Now, Mario, over the course of his career, he's made really profound contributions to Austrian economics, and in more recent years to behavioural public policy, actually. He's one of the central figures, I think, now in the field, in this new field of behavioural public policy. He wrote a book a few years ago called Escaping Paternalism, which is kind of like a critique, if you like, of the nudge or the paternalistic approach that's kind of dominated behavioural public policy. So on that note, I think Mario is somebody that enjoys, probably, challenging the orthodoxy. He's a contrarian, really. He's one of these guys that seems very grumpy, but when you get to know him, he's like a cuddly bear, really, aren't you, Mario? I'd say that, right? But people that challenge the orthodoxy, I think, and I speak from personal experience, you know, they're often not appreciated, I think, for many, many years. You know, it's difficult. It's hard work to challenge the orthodoxy. But you need those types of people, because I think that's how we get progress, really, right? Sometimes people that challenge the orthodoxy, they don't get even recognised in their own lifetimes, but happily, I think Mario is being increasingly recognised within his own lifetime. So it sort of gives me great pleasure to introduce Mario Rizzo today, and he's going to deliver for 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions this year's annual LSE Behavioural Public Policy Lecture. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you, Adam, for that generous, overly generous introduction. So I just have to live long enough, right, to be recognized. Okay, so I'm going to talk about normative rationality after behavioral economics, the effect of behavioral economics on the notion of rationality as a normative standard. And I'm going to ask what is left. The answer to the question is not much is left. So thank you very much, and that's the end of it. No, but it's good to know where I'm going before I get there. So first of all, before we begin, I should like to take a moment to recognize someone who would have been here this evening, but unfortunately cannot be. Paul Lewis was professor of political economy at King's College London. He was a friend, an intellectual colleague for about 3 decades, who died suddenly and unexpectedly a few weeks ago, gone too early, and he will be sorely missed. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to recognize him and his work. All right, so let's begin. Let me say something about the background to this endeavor, because it's important for all of us to be on the same page. Both behavioral economics and standard economics, standard neoclassical economics, share one thing in common, and that is they both conceive of rationality in structural terms. In particular, rational choice is defined as choice that satisfies rationality axioms. I'll get into that, especially including complete ordering of all the feasible options and consistency, and manifest in many different ways. Behavioral economics has justifiably subject these axioms of consistency and complete ordering to criticism from the descriptive point of view. They do not describe how people actually behave, it is said, and I think that's true. They don't describe how people actually behave. And yet, behavioral economists continue to think of the axioms as normative. So the question is, are they normative? My conclusions. They're just letting you know the conclusions first. The rationality axioms are not normative. They are merely modeling assumptions. The evaluation of preferences as rational or irrational cannot be done on internalist criteria. It must be made, if need be, for better or worse, on external criteria, which was essentially the position of Lionel Robbins in the 1930s. Since, as I agree with Nicholas Rescher, that's him there, who recently died, that rationality is as wide-ranging and complex as the domain of intelligence at large, I urge a liberal approach to evaluating people's decisions, and largely a hands-off policy that avoids paternalistic intervention. So I think it's useful to divide my talk into two parts. One is history, because the history, I think, will enlighten us about what's going on in the current period. So first some history and then some analysis, okay? So we begin with history. In the 19th century and earlier, the concept of axioms was undoubted statements about the world, essentially. So in the 19th century, the Irish economist John Eliot Cairns, who's sometimes called the last of the classical economists, decided to organize economics as he knew it in around 1870 or so in a axiomatic form. And what he did was he established 5 or 6 premises upon which he believed economics was based. Every one of these premises are statements about the world. So he believed that when you take these statements, these 5 statements, and you could pretty much derive the concepts of economics, the laws and conclusions of economics from these premises. So the first one is desire for material well-being, right? People have this desire. Mill said that this was a special part of human desire, but this is the one that was most relevant to economics. The intellectual ability to judge means to ends, right? If you're going to talk about using means to achieve ends, you have to have the ability intellectually to do this. Reaching ends by the least possible sacrifice seems common sense. The laws of population increase, something unique to the classical school, less common today. And 5, the law of diminishing marginal returns. So those were the premises upon which economics could be derived. The laws of economics, the discipline of economics could be derived. All statements about the world for which Cairns thought everybody pretty much would agree. Okay? Maybe nuances here and there, but essentially they were self-evident. And that's the concept of axioms, the older concept of axioms. So we move ahead now to 1890. John Neville Keynes, the father of John Maynard, who wrote a book in 1890 called The Scope and Method of Political Economy. And in that book, he added to the premises that Elliott Cairns had, decreasing marginal utility, defined psychologically, and free competition in most cases. So add those two premises to the ones of Cairns, and you have the premises of economics. Then we move ahead to 1932, 1935. Lionel Robbins decided that the critical part of economics was that people could order their preferences and that there was scarcity, and they perceived opportunities, different opportunities, and had to rank the different opportunities in terms of the preferences that they would satisfy. So his famous definition regarding the use of scarce means to achieve differently valued ends. These were, in his terms, undoubted facts of experience. So what about consistency? Robbins said something about consistency, but thought it was a minor issue. He said that consistency of preferences is required for certain analytical constructions. For example, the equimarginal principle requires assumption of consistency of preferences. But he said that, consistency of preferences is uneconomic to attain. Who can search all their preferences to decide whether they're consistent or not? And he refers to the famous idea of the marginal disutility of bothering about marginal utility. Right? Marginal utility is fine, but don't spend too much time worrying about it. So its ultimate point on consistency was that even people's preferences are not consistent, that that economics has something to say, because it's still the case that means are scarce in relation to ends, even though, as he said, the ends might be inconsistent. All the things that economists talk about are still around, even if people are inconsistent in their preferences. They still engage in exchange, production, there's still business fluctuations. In a world in which, get this, people do not know the full implications of what they are doing, right? So that's pretty radical in one respect. Now we move on to what I call the great transformation of axioms. And here we have David Hilbert, important mathematician of the early 20th century. And he transformed the idea of axioms from the older view to a new view. And here, axioms were simply necessary and sufficient conditions to support some theoretical structure. And the theoretical structure that he was interested in were mathematical structures. So he was interested in putting, for example, calculus on a firm basis and other mathematical approaches on a firm logical basis. But it was a task of logic, right? Of logical systems. No relation particularly to economics and to decision making, but logical systems like mathematical systems. The first person, that, at least as far as I can discover, and it's always dangerous to say who the first was for anything because there's always somebody out there who got it earlier. But the first person to axiomatize choice theory in the more or less contemporary sense was the great economist Ragnar Frisch, one of the early Nobel Prize winners. He's known for econometrics, but he has some contributions to this issue, issue of axiomatic economics. So what he did was he tried to axiomatize choice theory. He had some assumptions like people could order all their choices, that choices were transitive, that you could add utilities, and so he has a series of axioms. So the idea was just to put choice theory, or what we would say today, the utility function, on a firm mathematical foundation. He also wanted to derive an objective cardinal measure of marginal utility involving prices. He wanted to make welfare statements about the redistribution of income, and he wanted to estimate demand curves based on utility analysis. And he says that the plausibility of these axioms was to be judged by the propositions from the axioms, that you could deduce from the axioms, tested with statistical data. So the phenomenon that he wants to explain are statistical phenomena, and he thinks that this axiomatic system that he has or has developed will enable him to use objectively measurable factors to come up with results like measured marginal utility, and to know whether redistribution of income would increase social welfare and things of that sort. To the extent that the axioms are descriptive, they are descriptive, he says, of the average or typical individual. This is very similar to the idea that Jevons had. Jevons, in the 1860 or so, had the idea that people could be irrational, but that irrationalities cancel out. In other words, so it's the idea that irrational behavior is random behavior. And random behavior cancels out, so the typical individual, right, or the average individual, which is not any real individual, by the way. The typical average individual is not a real person. It's a construct, is rational. So Frisch says basically the same thing, that the typical or average individual behaves this way, but there's no normative argument, right? He's just deriving things in order to make predictions about demand curves and stuff of that sort. Okay, so now that's 1926, and with some articles later in 1930s elaborating on all of this. So then comes 1944, von Neumann and Morgenstern. Obviously, they're best known for game theory. It's funny because when I was in graduate school, I was told that by my professor, George Stigler, that game theory was just a footnote in the history of economic thought. And, anyway, but they also are responsible for expected utility theory. Now, at the time, there was a perceived need, this is clear from a lot of what various economists were saying at the time, to develop a theory of decision-making under uncertainty. All theories of decision-making before then seemed to be premised on a certain world. So they developed one, decision-making under risk. And they showed that if there were complete preference field ordering, transitivity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, then choices can be represented by expected utility maximization. And they say that they looked at choices that satisfied these axioms as rational. They use the term rational. But there's still an ambiguity here, and it persists. The ambiguity is you can find it in this quotation from Morgenstern from 1974, so much later. He says, the expected utility theory is normative in the sense that the theory is absolutely convincing, which implies that men will act accordingly. All right, so you see there's a connection between the normative aspect and the descriptive aspect, right? Because expected utility theory and its assumptions are absolutely convincing, then presumably if people are shown if people's decisions are demonstrated to be consistent or inconsistent with expected utility theory, they will change, right? If they're inconsistent because it's absolutely convincing, that they will change. So, do people act this way? Well, I guess if they're fortunate enough to have von Neumann and Morgenstern show them that it's absolutely convincing, then I guess they do. But there's an ambiguity there, you'll see. Okay. Now, the first one, obviously I like history, so. The first one to unambiguously endorse the normative view was not Leonard Savage, but Jacob Marshak. Now, Marshak was the chairman or the director of the Coles Commission, originally at the University of Chicago, from 1943 to 1948. But he remained a member of the Coles Commission through later directors. And in 1950, he wrote, 1551, he wrote a series of articles that endorsed the idea of these rationality axioms as being normative. And so he says that, well, okay, so we can extend the rigors of conventional logic and arithmetic to include further constraints on rational behavior. And these further constraints are the rationality axioms. And so then he says, we shall define rational behavior as that which follows those rules in addition to the rules of logic and arithmetic. Okay? Again, in 51, he says, people may often act contrary to these precepts or norms, so may not be descriptive. But then we say that they do not act reasonably. To discuss a set of norms of reasonable behavior is a problem in logic, not in psychology. It is a normative, not a descriptive problem. All right? Very clear. This is normative now. So then we go to Leonard Savage. Everybody calls him Jimmy Savage because that's what I guess he, but I never met him, so I'm not on first name basis with him. So Savage extended and more, but he extended expected utility theory into subjective expected utility theory, with the idea that people are acting on their subjective perceptions of probability, subjective probability. Bruno Di Finetti and company. So he says that the main use he's going to make of these axioms is normative, right? To police my own decisions for consistency and where possible to make complicated decisions depend on simpler ones. But, and I'm not quoting them anymore, but they define rational behavior only in small worlds. That's what he says. So these are essentially the worlds of gambling games, where all probabilities are fixed, all the options are known. Okay, but there's a problem. And the problem is that Savage wanted subjective utility theory to be used as a way of correcting decisions that were made not inconsistent with the axioms. But in order to do that, there's a problem. Because in order to get subjective probabilities and utilities, which he needs, out of just betting decisions, right? He wants to derive subjective probabilities and utilities from betting decisions. You have to assume that the axioms are followed. So the descriptive and the normative seem to work together in this case. So again, normative, but perhaps not prescriptive. And what do I mean by prescriptive? What I mean is, while the axioms could possibly indicate what rational behavior is like, you can't get from his theoretical structure enough information about irrational behavior to correct it. So not prescriptive in that sense. All right, finally, but the history. Gerard Debreu. Now, this is a very, very different thing, and I think in some ways Debreu is on the strongest ground of all of these people. He writes a theory of value in 1972, an axiomatic analysis of economic equilibrium. Here again, when I was in graduate school around that time, and I remember, I'm not going to say which professor said this, he said, well, why would you want to read that book? In any event, Debreu followed the inspiration, and he's explicit about this, of a group of mathematicians known as Bourbaki. Bourbaki was a collective, I guess, of mathematicians, French mathematicians, who wrote over a 20, 30-year period books and articles with the idea that they wanted to put various aspects of mathematics on firm logical basis. This was an effort in logic, essentially, right? So Debreu follows this. He says he's going to set up a system that is very versatile, right? So the system is created independently of its applications, so it's versatile. You can use the system to explore new relationships between things. So it's almost an exploratory framework. But what he uses it for, in particular, was to ground general equilibrium theory. And to ground it in a choice theoretic foundation. So there's no hint here of normativity, except in the sense that, you know, the axioms have to make the model work. But it's just a foundation of a logical system. All right, so we can conclude this part by saying that the axioms were originally statements about the real world, get transformed into more esoteric mathematical statements, initially with the view of just providing a foundation for theoretical constructs. Then there's some discussion about normativity, and then it sort of ends up with the Savage and normativity. But then Debreu takes over, and it becomes pretty much a non-normative, non-descriptive, but logical concept. Not everybody took that line as Debreu did. So we still have people saying that the axioms are normative. All right, so now let me go on to the analysis, and I'll try to make this brief. I think that the axioms are vacuous. They have no content, and let me say why. As a generalization, I would say they don't either constrain or enlarge our understanding of normative rationality. Nevertheless, behavioral economists interpret violations of these axioms as exhibiting some form of pathology. For example, if your preferences are intransitive, right, then the implication is, well, the decision-making context must be too complex, or maybe you're being manipulated, right? If you engage in inconsistent discounting, that is to say, if you discount near options more heavily than far out options, then you must have myopia, or maybe you're addicted to the near options. If you are vulnerable to framing, things that are equivalently described. In other words, the doctor says the operation has a 90% success rate, or he says it has a 10% failure rate. It makes a difference to you what he says, even though those are logically equivalent. If you're sensitive to that, you're illogical in some sense. So you need to be fixed. All right. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get rid of revealed preference in its strong behavioral sense. Otherwise, nothing makes any sense anymore. I'll show you why in a minute. But I believe that you have to establish meaning before you can even address the question of rationality. If you observe things in terms of objective actions without a sense of what the agent means by his choices, you'll be led to find lots of violations of rationality, and these things will falsely suggest pathology. I think Knight had it right in 1944. He says, in the discussion of conduct, we cannot separate description from the teleological interpretation. That is, the what from the why in this sense. What is done from what is achieved or expected to be achieved. So in other words, the action, right, is essentially an expectation. It has a meaning. And it's not just like grabbing something, and you notice that, a person grabs a pen and then grabs something else and grabs a third thing and try to decide whether that's consistent or not. You've got to first look at the meaning. So although we do choose objects or courses of action, our choices are not objects. They are acts of meaning. So we establish that, and we look at the axioms from that point of being informed about their meaning. Oh, this is fancy here. Okay. Oh, no, it's not all done. Oh, my goodness gracious. All right. So Maurice's irrationality. This is from John Broome, 1995. The picture is not of Maurice, but of John Broome. So this is a person's preferences. Now notice, I'm going to give an explanation, and this is the explanation that Broome gives in his discussion of Maurice, of the preferences. So they're not just preferences or sort of, in a sense, objects or trips in this case, without any specific meaning. So let's go through what Broome does. So this person, Maurice, prefers A, going to Rome, over going skiing in the Alps. He says, culture is good enough reason to forego showing courage. Now, what does that mean? Well, the trick is that Maurice thinks that going to the Alps skiing is also a display of courage. It's not just going to the Alps skiing and whatever is involved in it. It's a display of courage. So culture is good enough reason to forego showing courage. So A is preferred to B. But now, when going to the Alps is compared to staying home, right? Well, then choosing home over the Alps would show cowardice. So he prefers, right, B to C. But now, when you ask him about staying home versus going to Rome, he says, it's okay to put relaxation over cultural education. And so therefore, he prefers, right, staying home to going to Rome. Well, if you work this out, it's not transitive, right? So, is he pathological? I don't think so. Now, one reason, which I'll discuss in a second, is that you may think, well, wait a minute now, isn't he going overboard in thinking that people are going to consider him a coward because he preferred to stay home rather than go skiing in the Alps, right? Maybe he's a psychiatrist or something like that, right? All right, I'll get to that in a minute. So, redescription. Now, this is a trick, and Broome, this is in Broome, he says, well, really, there aren't three options, which were still on the previous one, right? There are really six. Why? Because what the option is compared to is itself an option. So, when we talk about going to the Alps compared to staying home, that's one thing. But if we talk about going to the Alps, this is the last one here, BA, with the alternative going to Rome, that's something else, right? And the same thing with respect to all of these. So you get these preferences, and there's no, there's no intransitivity here. Perfectly reasonable preferences. So then you ask yourself, as you should, how is it that, is this redescription legitimate? I say there are three things that could generate the redescription. One is purely mechanical. You notice that, right, when the alternative is one thing, he chooses one way and another way. So you just mechanically set up those 6 things and it fits. So you saved transitivity, right? You get the prize. Or you can do what Broom was doing in the example. He's using the rationale of the actor, right? So you put them in the way you did with the alternative because that's how the actor thinks of it. So you're a good subjectivist, you're a good respecter of the preferences, even if they seem weird, of the individual. There's a third one, which is the one that Broom chooses, but I object to, is that the approval of the economist. Is it rational to fear being called a coward in these circumstances? Broom says no. So therefore, okay, going back to the original intransitivity, that's an example of some sort of irrationality. So the redescription doesn't work because he makes the judgment that the actor is being irrational. So the purely mechanical one and the rationale of the actor are vacuous. They empty the axiom of all constraints. Just about anything can be described, redescribed to save the axiom. And Broom's solution rejects value neutrality. So I'm not happy with that, but I'll say more about that in a minute. This idea of redescription is important. It's sometimes called individuation. Is always possible. All intransitive behaviors can be redescribed in a way that transitivity is not violated. Broom himself says, whenever you meet anyone who has intransitive preferences, it will always be possible to individuate outcomes more finely to restore transitivity. So the axiom performs no useful function in differentiating rational from non-rational. The only way you get that is if you declare some aspect of the person's behavior to be irrational, which you didn't need the axiom to do that. However, many redescriptions undermine the logical function of transitivity axiom, providing a mathematical basis for the utility function. Why? Because if you take the redescription seriously, you've got these 6 options. Okay, well, one of the options that is implied by redescription is staying home without cowardice is preferred to going to the Alps. But this is a nonsense. It's nonsense because by the assumption of the problem, you cannot stay home without cowardice if the alternative is going to the Alps. So it produces a nonsense option to think of it in those ways and therefore undermines the utility function. Broom is quite aware of that. And so have others. Nothing new there. So, therefore, if we redescribe so as to make sense from the broader rationality perspective, that is, as seen by the agent himself, we undermine the logical function of the axiom, or at least in, I believe, most cases we will. But it's also clear that the redescription is a slave of a broader conception of rationality. We redescribed because we thought, or at least it's possible to think, that even though it's intransitive, it makes sense. So we go to the broader notion, and we, in some sense, undermine the transitivity axiom. If we choose not to redescribe, then we have to call, if sticking with strict economics, we have to call the behavior irrational. Today, of course, behavioralists don't like the word irrational. They use the polite word less than rational or boundedly rational. But the conclusion is being driven just by the structure. It's not being driven by some broader notion of rationality. We see that the structure limits what we can say, reasonably say, about people's behavior. Okay, so giving up preference agnosticism. I'm nearly done now. I don't like Broom's solution to say, okay, we'll rule the person's behavior about fear of being called a coward as irrational, and thus restore transitivity that way. I don't like that because I don't think, first of all, I don't think it's convincing, right, that it's irrational. But in general, economics and behavioral economists as well claim to respect the preferences of people, right, as judged by themselves, in the famous expression that Cass Sunstein likes to use. But there is no internal structure, as I think I've shown, because you can always redescribe to fit the structure, which means it doesn't constrain, it has no falsifiability, it doesn't distinguish between rational, irrational. Sen says in 1993, we cannot determine whether a person is failing in any way without knowing what he's trying to do. That is, without knowing something external to the choice itself, which agreeing with Knight from 1944. All right, so getting to my conclusions. That's Elizabeth Anscombe, good philosopher, specialized in Wittgenstein. But I think that rationality is too wide, too variable, and oftentimes implicit, and it's far more and sometimes less than logic. And there's a lot of room for external judges' own values to enter in this, and that's something we have to be careful about. This doesn't mean that people can't offer opinions about rationality to other people. This can be helpful, as long as they're opinions, right? I think what you're doing is stupid. I think what you're doing is irrational. Of course, it's not fashionable to say that to people anymore because we have to be sensitive to their feelings. But it can be helpful. All right, but this doesn't mean that there could not be cases of irrationality, but they're never obvious, I would say. Consider this example from Elizabeth Anscombe. She says, imagine a person who says, I need to get my camera. And you say, well, where's your camera? My camera's upstairs. Okay. And then she says, so I'm going downstairs to get my camera. So then you say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Two things are going on. First, I think, unless this person is, crazy, whatever that means, the principle of charity is you're misunderstanding something, right? She's saying, maybe I'm going downstairs to do something first, and then I'm going to go. You try to figure out, you presume her rationality, right? But if it's clear that she's saying what she's saying, and there's no more to it, well, okay, so she's irrational. So I'm not saying irrationality is impossible, but what I'm saying is it's difficult to discover because we have a presumption of rationality, and I think it's a valid presumption. Rationality in the broader sense, not in the narrow economic sense. So, what do I think then in terms of policy mistakes and things of that sort? I'm impressed with Douglas Bernheim's characterization or notion of errors of characterization. In other words, Bernheim says that all these other things, biases, they're not biases, and there's nothing wrong, that they're fine. But what's probably not fine is when people misunderstand the problem that they have to solve, okay? These are what he calls errors of characterization. we think the problem is A, but it really is B, okay? Or we think that C will lead to A, but it leads to B, or something of that sort. Right? Problems of characterization. So in the old days, we would have said something like, more prosaically, when people lack knowledge or information, they don't make good decisions. Okay, so now we call them problems of characterization. But I think that providing information is a function that the anti-paternalist Mill did not object to. Neither should we when the market doesn't provide it. So my conclusions. My conclusions are, and this is William James, one of my favorite philosophers and psychologists. The rationality axioms are presuppositions required to logically support utility functions or other analytical concepts. They're part of a modeling choice. They're a modeling requirement. They have no normative significance in themselves. The idea that they do, I want to call a vicious abstractionism from James. The method of treating a concept or a theory as exhaustive of the reality that it purports to explain. And so I urge a liberal approach to rationality and a liberal policy that recognizes the full diversity of human rationality. And that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We're going to take questions and comments. I don't know, do you want to sit down or do you want to stand up?
I want to stand up.
Okay.
If I sit down,
Okay, Mario's going to stand up. When I sort of sent out the blurb for this lecture, I said, didn't I, if you don't remember, I said, for those who are attending, there could be a behavioural economic related prize to the best question or comment, right?
I have a question. I have a question.
You'll get enough prize. You can make a good question. You're demonstrating present bias now.
Okay.
The Behavioural Economic Prize is a really good one. A few years ago, I designed a poster that sort of lists all the sort of behavioural economic phenomena, and that's the prize. So that's why I think it's a good one. If you hang on to this, if you're worth something on eBay in 200 years' time, you might get £10 for it. So the poster goes to the best question and the best comment. And how do we decide that? Well, Mario, at the end, the questions and comments, you're going to decide who gave the best comment or the best question, Mario. So keep it in mind.
No, I want you.
No, you're going to decide. You're the guest.
I don't want to make enemies. You can make enemies. All right. Okay.
You can be either popular or unpopular.
Okay. All right. Good.
Okay. So questions and comments. If you could sort of just identify yourself before you ask your question. Who wants to go? Yeah.
Richard Bradley, I'm in the philosophy department here at the LSE. So the thing that always strikes me about the Maurice example is that when it's presented, people's reaction to it always involves producing rationales for the preferences that are exhibited here. And that suggests to me that rationality, normative rationality, in particular the transitivity condition, is playing a role here, precisely because people feel something needs explanation here. If there was no concept of normative rationality here, why would we need an explanation for what we're observing here? So it seems that that's precisely what Savage had in mind when he talked about the role of these axioms as policing our behavior. When we see some set of preferences, in this case intransitive ones, we can't just leave things as they are. We have two choices. We can either produce a rationale for them, which involves re-individuating the options in some kind of way, or we can revise our preferences. Either way, we've got to do something, and the fact that we've got to do something here shows that normative rationality has force.
Okay. First of all, let's be clear. Normative rationality. What does that mean? For me, normative rationality in the context of this means the rationality of the system of thought, the rationality axioms. Now, because it is neither necessary nor sufficient for my actions to be irrational in some broader sense, for they to be intransitive, neither necessary nor sufficient, right? So what is it doing? It's not doing anything. You can declare this Maurice to be rational or irrational depending upon what you think of his neurosis, say, wanting not to be considered a coward by his friends. It didn't take in the exam, I mean, you know, Broom is setting up an example, and I think what he's setting up the example to show that redescription is always possible. Now, the role that the reasons have is to give some rationale to the particular redescription that he engages in. If you were just looking at this from the point of view of the old sort of behaviorist revealed preference, you would just see these preferences, right? Without those comments that I added, giving the reasons, and then you would be at a complete loss to figure out, well, what's going on? You would say they're intransitive, but so what? They're intransitive, right? So what? So I don't think that it performs any function. You can make it perform a function in the sense that you can, in a subjective sense, get all bent out of shape every time you see intransitive preferences, and therefore you have to run to some explanation. But that's in your own mind. That's not a necessity, right? Neither necessary nor sufficient. So, good.
Okay, I have a response. Let other people. Roberto, I think you were next, and then you go around.
Thank you. Roberto Fumagalli, King's College London, previous supervisee of Richard, actually. So I'd like to build a bit on Richard's question, Mario. So I have two tentative replies on to the kind of vacuity charge that you were raising against the redescription strategy. So let's take first Broom strategy. Broom, I think, makes an important distinction between extreme and more moderate version of what he calls Humeanism.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you that going the extreme Humean version, according to which you can have any pattern of preference whatsoever, would be admissible. That would be vacuous, I think. But the moderate version of Humeanism, according to which you can only have whatever kind of a consistent pattern of preferences, might be questionable, might be an unstable midway house, but I really don't see why it would be vacuous as opposed to questionable or challengeable. And related to the...
Well, you can establish it by definition. You can say, well, reasonable behavior requires consistent preferences. You know, okay, then that's how you're done with it by definition. But what does that mean? Why is that useful?
And related to this, actually, the challenge of trying to basically characterize choice options as they are perceived or valued by the agents themselves. I mean, I would agree with you again that different redescription might be questionable, contestable, challengeable on the basis of different data, different level of description. But again, I wouldn't see how that would be vulnerable to a vacuity thesis. I mean, I think that in order to substantiate a vacuity thesis, it will be up to you to actually show that all redescriptions, so to speak, are more or less equivalent or anything goes, whereas I think we can actually ground or consider a judgment regarding the different level of scientific plausibility or permissibility of different kind of redescription. And that alone, I take it to be, will be a challenge to a pure vacuity thesis.
Okay, let me say this more generally. Economists say, and behavioral economists say, that preferences can be anything. So in some sense, maybe inconsistently, they're extreme Humeans, right? Better that the world should fall apart than my finger would be, okay? Be injured. So they are. Now I would say that they are perhaps inconsistent in saying that, okay, you can have any preferences you want, but it has to have a certain structure. But I think more than inconsistent, I still insist that the structure is vacuous because you can always redescribe. And I gave three rationales for redescribing: the agents, or the mechanical, and the economist's evaluation. Now, you're going to the economist's evaluation, which is what Broom is doing, because he's a moderate Humean, okay? But I don't think that adds anything. You can be a moderate Humean and just say, it's irrational to be so concerned about people thinking you're a coward. No transitivity, no redescription, nothing. You don't need any of that. You can just say it. Right? And instead of going through all these hoops, that's it, just hoops.
Well, I said you challenged the orthodoxy. That was just an example of that.
Yeah.
Alex, you had your hand up in the book, I think.
Thank you. So, Alex Fauve, also from philosophy. You've got the philosophers very excited. So, I didn't hear much from you about why you thought this second of the three ways out in the Maurice case, but the same goes in lots of other cases. You know, we can think of the gain or loss framing in the famous Asian disease case and so on. That strategy is essentially saying, let's use the judgments or preferences of the person themselves to decide whether or not there's a violation of transitivity going on.
Right.
And what's interesting to me is that if we look psychologically at studies that find that, for example, confront people with two different framings of the Asian disease case after they've chosen separately in the standard pattern, or that might imaginarily confront Maurice with this alleged intransitivity, and we say, are your choices consistent? That's when either they are forced to offer a justification for their different responses in the reframings or the pattern of choice in the Maurice original case, or they say, I must have made a mistake somewhere. And interesting, I must have made a mistake somewhere is a quote from one of the earliest papers of Tversky studying intransitivity among students who he presented with choices on who should you let into university. And he'd set it up so that they would predictably make intransitive choices in pairwise things. Then when he presented them with the full thing, the standard response that he quotes from people is, I don't know where I made a mistake, but I must have made it somewhere. So that's actually precisely what Richard was saying, and which I think does go with the full subjectivist route. The subjectivist route being, let's use the values of the person themselves to judge whether what we see here is an irrationality. And you criticized the Brumian kind of economist perspective one. You criticized the vacuity of, you can redescribe it anyway, but you didn't really say much about this middle road where you let the person themselves judge whether they committed an irrational.
Okay. Clearly, if a person judges that they have done something irrationally, then we ought to take that, respect that. But two things are the case. One, it doesn't require intransitivity to come to the conclusion of irrationality. Secondly, that as far as I know, the evidence about whether people change their behavior when shown intransitivities is mixed. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And furthermore, you know, I have a strong sense that in terms of policy, foundations for policies, that searching for genuine intransitivities as a policy tool is not practical. I mean, I think you really need to know, you really need to talk to the person to figure out what in fact they're trying to do, right? Also, I would have to say, pairwise comparisons are not fixed in heaven, right? That's a construction. The idea that preferences are determined in these pairwise comparisons, you could take three things, right, four things, and I'll say, okay, I want number 4, I want number 3. Pairwise comparison was something convenient to fit in to the structure, the mathematical structure that they were using, but it's not fixed in reality, it's an artifact. So, you know, let's be careful about what is an artifact of a particular structure and what has to do with the underlying reality. So I would say, to answer your question succinctly, yes, take seriously people's views of their own behavior, but what follows from that, who knows?
Okay, so I've got book and then I'll come out to Leon. If anybody else has got questions, you can put your hands up as well.
Bauke Plantace King's College London. I'm just not really convinced that the Maurice example is a particularly convincing violation of transitivity, because you're really introducing a bundle of goods, right? There's a trip and there's reputation. It's a little bit like saying, oh, well, someone prefers 3 oranges over 2 over 1. They prefer 1 orange over 3 if you add 17 apples.
Yeah, right.
That's not convincing.
Right. That's another way to re-describe. That's what I would say. It's another way to re-describe. So what you basically have is you have further consequences, right? And if you list or make clear what all the consequences of the behavior are, then you get in a specific case basically the same thing, right? When you're comparing staying home with going to the Alps, you get this threat of cowardice, right? So that becomes a consequence of choosing under the circumstance where the alternative is staying at home. So it's not a pure phenomenon because it's not purely a phenomenon that's derived from incomplete description of the consequences. It's a phenomenon that arises because one set of consequences is affected by the specific thing that you're comparing in this pairwise comparison. Right? You're putting the two things at odds with each other. They're making it very, very clear that you're giving up the one for the other. Now, if you would put all 3 options in the choice set, you say, which one do you want? Which is the best one? And he picks one, that's it, right? You didn't have pairwise and you didn't have any problem. And you don't know why he chose the one he did. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just say it's another way of re-describing. Sen gives a one that has to do with, politeness. You take the big apple when there's only a big apple and a small apple, right? But if there's a big apple, small apple, and an orange, you might take the big apple. But if there's only a big apple, small apple, you don't take the big apple because it's impolite. It's a similar kind of thing.
Professor.
Wait.
No, sorry, I'm done.
There's a question from Liam first.
Hi, so Liam Bass-McGrath, faculty in the social department here at LSE. So if I kind of take as given, like the idea of, if I take as given the kind of idea of the subjectivity with regards to the utility function, preference relation construction, then if I kind of follow this logic to its conclusion, then are you basically implying that consequentialist policymaking is just not a normative criteria that we can actually abide by because it engages in the exact same kind of constructions analytically in order to do so?
No. I mean, look, this now gets to a point which I didn't discuss. It's an omission here, but I omitted it for lack of time, I thought. And that is the Chicago view of all this, right? There's a recent book out called Price Theory, written by 3 Chicago economists. And I looked to see what are they, about axioms and all of that. Because I remember when I was a graduate student there, I didn't know there were any axioms. We just started out with the demand curve. So what did they say? They say, well, if you're interested in axioms, this is a specialist concern, and there are books that you could look at. But we here are concerned about using economics to explain real-world problems, real-world phenomena. And so, essentially, what they're accepting is the Friedman idea, right? That people's actions are of such a nature that they reflect an as-if following of the axioms. But now this is the crucial point. The axioms in the Chicago view, and I think the correct view, is not that they explain individual behavior, but they explain market regularities. So you're not using transitivity, right, to explain individual behavior. You're presupposing that the structure that assumes transitivity is useful because people's ultimate actions in a collective sense, their ultimate collective response, is consistent with the system. So you're never explaining individual behavior, you're just explaining, so that's why you can go straight to the demand curve, because after all, right, what are you interested in as a student? You're interested in demand curve slope down. You're not interested in, whether Joe's preferences are transitive. It's kind of like a category mistake or something. It's not meant to describe individual behavior. So therefore, from a Chicago point of view, right, if you come out, you have a theory and it says, if you do X, Y, and Z, you have this effect. Then you can judge the effect as good or bad, depending upon your policy preferences, or, whatever, using this apparatus, because you're not making predictions about people. You're making predictions about aggregate market responses. So that's how I would treat that.
But before I let the other question come in, because I think builds on Liam, and I think probably Alex and Richard as well, is that it seems to me anyway that you often get, I think there's a slight sort of intransigence rather than intransitivity between their understanding, between people's understanding, not collectively, but people's understanding from one side and the arguments that are put forward from the other side in this debate. And I think it boils down to there being an almost self-evident belief that what we should be focusing upon is outcomes, because that's been the essence of the development of economics and other consequentialist frameworks as well. Right? You can't really get out of it. It's consequence that matters. But I think, for me anyway, and I think for you, Mario, and for people like Bob Soto, you start to think, well, why? Why do consequences matter? Why do we care about what other people have as their outcomes? It's their lives. Let them lead it. So long as we've got the appropriate rules in place, the rules of the game, the sort of contractarian or deontological side of the argument, don't worry so much about outcome. If people are intransitive, let them be intransitive. They might have reasons for that. But as long as the rules of society are in place so that we kind of live tolerably together, people can pursue whatever they want, right? So I think sometimes that's kind of lost. It's like almost like an epistemological divide. You've got to get across for people like Mario, I might be putting words in your mouth.
No.
But people like me, outcomes don't matter so much. It's the rules that matter.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, at the back.
Thank you, Professor. Amazing presentation, by the way. I'm Mars, from research student from economics department. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this discussion has been a play of semantics almost. When you say rationality, I can think of two notions, two separate notions. The first notion is a criticism of one person's intellects. It's an insult, right? The other notion is a pseudonym for model foundation. As a theorist in training, I have made peace that when economists say irrationality, they mean the second definition. In that sense, all the examples you have shown us are tautologically irrational because they violate some sort of conventional model. The decision maker in Marie's example is irrational because in expected utility theory, it is constructed that an agent must engage in pairwise comparison. It is artificial, definitely, but it is irrational in the sense that it violates the model we use to analyze human being. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your problem, your thesis statement here is that you're concerned that people confuse these two notions and use irrationality, the model violation, to justify policy intervention. That feels like what you're saying when you go through all this history of axioms and definition of irrationality. Because to me, there is no problem with all these definitions, right? Model, at the end of the day, are artificial tools that theorists use to analyze the world. When you make that extra step, when you say irrationality in validating my model means that I have used policy to save them, that's the problem, right? Do I get that right?
I don't disagree with you, actually. But what I disagree with is your assumption that all economists, and especially economists, behavioral stripe and economists who are interested in policy, think that way. Because instead of saying the model doesn't work, they say people are behaving irrationally or with bounded rationality or some sort of deficiency of behavior. So they're using what you say is simply the model to as a normative standard, and I object to that. So I agree with you. If people would say simply the model, the traditional model or this particular model doesn't work to explain people's behavior, that's fine, right? So then what's the answer? Well, conceivably, the most intuitive answer is change the model, right? But another possible answer is the people have to be fixed to fit the model. And that's what I think is happening. People need to be fixed, not that the model needs to be fixed. I have no objection to, quasi-hyperbolic discounting or anything like that as a model, but, So I basically agree with you.
Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Tony Hockney, LSE. I just wonder whether the dichotomy that you present represents behavioural economics in 2025. And from what I see, there's a lot more humility in the field, asking the questions of why people do things. And
That's because you know me. That's who
you look at. So I'm interested in policy making. So if you look at things like Halsworth's manifesto, it's a world away for the application of behavioural economics to 10, 15 years ago. It was saying, not that this is irrational, but why are people doing this? I disagree with Adam on the objectivity. I mean, most policy questions in practice are about why are these people costing us money? And there is a reason why we need to pursue those avenues, and we've seen it this week in this autumn, in the spring state in the UK. And why are these people costing us money? And we need to ask them, as you said. I just, I wonder if this really reflects behavioural economics in 2025, that all behavioural economics treats the axioms as being sort of
Okay, yeah.
relative.
It's a good point, and obviously, I think some of the better behavioral economists are more and more aware of some of the problems with the older version. But I still think that there is this, certainly to the extent that you're dealing with paternalistic policies, the older version, I think, is still the one that's operative. Now, if you're concerned about why are these people costing us money, all right. So if the problem is people are saving too little for their retirement, and thus they're going to be a burden on the public treasury, that's different from saying people are spending too little for their retirement and it's inconsistent with their true preferences, and therefore they need to be nudged in the right direction. I would prefer, if the real problem is you want the public treasury to be less burdened and you want people to save more, okay, just say it. And don't say this is what they really want.
It becomes an externality of it.
Yes.
I think Valentine, you had your hand.
Thank you. And thank you for your lecture tonight. And I was wondering.
Say who you are, Valentine. Tell everybody.
Okay, I'm Valentine, and I'm in the course of Adam Oliver this year. And it might sound like a broad question, but acknowledging for the full diversity of human rationality, do you think that humans are predictably unpredictable, or are we dealing with complete randomness outside of the market? And do you think that a single behavioral intervention is efficient to tackle the diversity of human rationality?
Okay, you had a lot of questions there. Let me answer it this way. There is a psychologist who I'm told is supposedly one of the major psychologists of the 20th century, Jerome Kagan, who taught at Harvard University. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. But he wrote a book maybe about 10 years ago called Psychology's Ghosts. And the point he makes, the overall point that he's making in the book, is that the findings of psychology are highly contextual. That is to say, he puts it this way. He says that few psychological generalizations are widely applicable. So very, very contextual. Now, Daniel Kahneman dealt with this issue at one point and said that what he was discovering are generalizations of intermediate level generalizations. In other words, contextual, so the biases are contextual, but not so contextual as to vary significantly from context to context, making them in some sense unusable. Now, I kind of, I did my research on the escaping paternalism. I found a lot more contextuality than Kahneman was willing to admit on almost all of the biases, depending upon all sorts of things. So I think that our ability to generalize about human behavior, at least in these terms of specific biases, is very limited, all right? Very highly contextual. But I do believe that people do make mistakes. I believe they do stupid things. But to say that doesn't mean you have to buy a whole system of thought, which I think is not justifiable. At least it doesn't show the intermediate level of generalizability that Kahneman and others claimed for. Highly, much more contextual. So that's my general answer to your question.
Any questions? Yeah, one here and then.
Yeah, thank you so much for your speech. I'm Edward Chen from BSc Econ here at the LSE. So my question is on the final sentence of the conclusion, that you urge a liberal approach to rationality and a liberal policy to recognize full diversity of human rationality. So I was wondering, what exactly would you define as a liberal approach, and what would be the liberal policy? Because if you consider in a micro level, there could be different nudges, there could be different small government policies and advertisements. And also in macro level, we still have the social welfare function, other things that utilize the utilities. And how would you consider policies in different contexts, and how that would take place?
Okay, that's a big question too.
There's a really good book on a liberal approach to
Political economy, yeah. Why don't you join the class? Okay. Okay. First of all, by liberal, I mean 19th century liberal, all right? Hands off. As far as these micro nudges and all that, I'm against all of them. Now, I'm not, let me back up here. I'm against all of them as used by the state, all right? When employers do things like, where they used to have an option of making the enrollment in the retirement programs that they run, or they organize, automatic. One could conceive of that as some sort of nudge. I think of it as a recommendation by the employer to enroll, that enrollment is good, right? So I'm not against that. I am against the fact that the government of the United Kingdom and the United States has made automatic enrollment mandatory with the ability to opt out. I think it's unjustifiable. I don't go along with that. On other policies, I'm a liberal. I mean, I was trained at the University of Chicago. I consider myself an Austrian economist. So I don't believe in much government. I believe the social welfare function is imaginary. I mean, what is that exactly? You see the disagreements that we have. in the political sphere, and we're supposed to have a social welfare function. I don't buy that idea.
There was a question over here on this side, wasn't there? In the grey hoodie. Just say who you are again.
Leonel, I'm in senior sec. So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. I heard you say about advocate for minimal government intervention and advocate against nudging for a specific policy, but surely barriers to an individual performing the action which they want to do could be solved through government intervention. For example, if I want to get a job in London but I cannot because of high mortgage prices, surely government intervention, putting a cap on rent, would solve that and allow me to do the action which I want to do, but still would not otherwise.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's a nudge.
That's, no, that's not a nudge. A nudge has to do, or behavioral, paternalist policy has to do with you making decisions that it is argued that you really want to make, okay, but are prevented from making by some decision-making failure of your own, not by scarcity, right? The reason housing prices in London are high is because there's a scarcity. There also, a friend of mine did some work and said there are all sorts of regulations that reduce the supply of housing in London, whatever the reason is. So you're looking at it from the point of view of expanding your choice set beyond what you personally can afford, or something like that. But that's not really what I'm talking about. And I would object that I would say that the housing cap would rent control has done a lot of damage everywhere it's been used. So that's another question. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's all I.
Okay, I think we'll take that as the last question. So what we need now, Mario, is if you can remember all those questions, to pick the person that you thought gave you the best question or comment. Or let's say the least worst questions.
No, they were all good. They were all good questions. So I'm going to shamelessly nominate my friend Roberto Fumagalli. Because we've been discussing this stuff for a long time, and he deserves it because of his persistence. If nothing else, so.
Okay, just before we finish then, obviously I think Mario did a great job tonight in defending his and promulgating his particular point of view. Of course, there's always going to be really sort of deep differences of view between those that adopt a more paternalistic framework and those that sort of have a more liberal mindset in behavioural public policy. But I think it's very, very important for everybody engaged in this area to think very deeply about the evidence and the arguments that are being put forward before you kind of reach your own informed conclusion about what you think is the appropriate thing to do. I see so many people in this field of behavioural public policy that almost accept things at face value. I mean, over the course of time, my views have changed a lot. I was a paternalist, and I'm certainly not a paternalist anymore, I don't think. And other people might go the other way. You know, people that are more liberal, such as Mario, might become more paternalist. I think it's very, very important to think. Okay, Mario gave, I think, a very good talk, and for those of you who know, Richard Titmuss, the founder of the Department of Social Policy at the LSE, one of the funders of this particular event tonight, believed in the gift relationship. Right? So I think we should give you some gifts. So I've got a little bag of gifts for you here.
So is this the endowment effect?
That will have a huge endowment effect.
Well, thank you so much.
For the rest of you, there's a...